Now we're going to talk about the Progressive Era. As I've mentioned repeatedly, historians like to periodize things. We talked for a long time about the Gilded Age, which was roughly the mid-1870s to, let's say the mid-1890s. That's another thing historians do, is argue about when these periodizations begin and end. But let's say that the Progressive Era, roughly, is the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Earlier we discussed the populist movement, which took hold in a big way in the 1890s, and it was a reaction against the excesses of the Gilded Age by those elements of society who suffered the most under it, farmers and industrial workers, banding together, forming really a movement in opposition to those excesses. The Progressive Era, I think you could say that that's when that opposition expanded and grew beyond just the farmers and industrial workers, and grew to the public in general in many ways. As the Progressive Era continued, more and more people came around to that way of thinking. Which way of thinking? The progressive way of thinking that we'll be discussing. And I would ask that you be careful not to conflate this term, the Progressive Era and progressivism, with contemporary, modern political approaches, because really, as we'll see in the election of 1912, there were several parties represented, and each of them was progressive to some extent. Anyhow, the Progressive Era sees, like I said, more and more middle-class people, and people in general, sort of coming around to this movement against the just full-scale, unfettered capitalism of the Gilded Age. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire is something that you may have heard of before. They talk about it in high school often. It did not take place at the beginning of the Progressive Era. It's actually about halfway through. So I'm not putting this up here to show that this is what started progressivism. I'm saying that this incident about halfway through is a good signifier of the sort of thing that a lot of people were upset about in the world around them during the Progressive Era. This factory, which was located in Manhattan, was worked in mostly by young women. They worked there producing clothing. There was a fire in 1911, and standard operating procedure in this factory and a lot of other factories was to, once the workday started, block all the exits, and that was so that workers couldn't sneak away, and steal time from their employer by goofing around, or sneak out the exits with cloth or other material that they were stealing. So to prevent that, they just blocked up all the exits. Well, what happens when there's a fire in this multi-story building? There's no way out. And 146 people died, most of them young women. This is obviously something that's going to be in the news. It's still in the history books. Something that is going to make the public irate. If you're the kind of person who wanted to just go about your daily life without giving too much thought to the working conditions in the buildings around you, if you lived in New York, it's kind of hard to do that. When something this big happens, a lot of these poor young women, to escape the flames, jumped from the top of the building to their deaths. So, if you're walking along and a flaming young woman lands in front of you, it's kind of hard to ignore the situation. So, as I said, this sort of incident made people more and more angry, really, At the beginning of this period, during the height of the Gilded Age, there were no workplace safety regulations at all. Over the course of the Progressive Era, those types of regulations were called for, and the types of working conditions that were plaguing people were more and more often being exposed. They were being exposed by a group of riders that came to be known as muckrakers, a term that was applied to them not in a complimentary way, that was implying that they were out in the mud, scratching around, trying to dig up things that were better left covered up. They didn't believe those things were better left covered up, but rather that they should be exposed. This included not only non-fiction writers, but also some fiction writers. Among the non-fiction muckrakers, you had people like Lewis Hine, who did a series of photographs of child laborers, which was a big problem. Lincoln Steffens wrote a book called The Shame of the Cities that talked about political corruption. Ida Tarbell wrote The History of the Standard Oil Company, and that was not the official Rockefeller-sanctioned history by any means. Among novelists, you had people like Theodore Dreiser, who wrote a novel called Sister Carrie about a naive young woman who comes to the city and is corrupted, and a book that many of you have probably heard of, some of you may have read, The Jungle, by Upton Sinclair. The Jungle was about the working conditions at a meatpacking plant. It was a very successful book. A lot of Americans read it and were appalled and disgusted to read about the way the sausage was made, so to speak. The poor sanitary conditions in these meatpacking plants led to an outcry, eventually to the government under Teddy Roosevelt, setting up the Food and Drug Administration so as to impose standards on, food and drug manufacturers. The sort of ironic thing about The Jungle is that Sinclair, although he did describe those conditions, his primary focus in the book was to describe the poor working conditions of the laborers at those plants, and that sort of got lost in the general hoopla. There's a photo of child laborers taken by Lewis Hine. There was a general move toward reform, society reform, social reform, fixing things during the Progressive Era. Things like child labor, workplace safety, and women's rights. None of those were new, but there was a renewed enthusiasm for them and for other types of reforms. Women, of course, had been working hard to gain their civil rights, really, for many decades, ultimately culminating in the adoption of the 19th Amendment in 1920 and the vote being made available for women throughout the country. This time period, particularly the 19-teens, was a period known for the espousal of feminism. And some people called that emancipation of women, quote, both as a human being and a sex being. Some feminists were calling for women to have complete control over their own bodies, which of course was difficult for many people of that time period to accept. In particular, you had this woman in the photograph there, Margaret Sanger, a name you might be familiar with. She was a proponent of birth control. She said that women should control their own bodies. She led several organizations that eventually came to be coalesced into Planned Parenthood. She was active until the 1960s. At one point she was arrested for distributing literature about birth control, and for a while she had this journal which aptly summed up attitudes of some feminists of that time. The journal was called The Woman Rebel. No gods, no masters. Another woman who was prominent in the progressive era was Jane Addams of Chicago. She established in 1897 the Hull House, which was a settlement house, a concept she had read about that had been experimented with in Europe. Basically, the Hull House was located in Chicago in an area with a lot of European immigrants. It was a place where some people could come and live, and others from the neighborhood could come and basically get assistance of various kinds. There was an employment agency, there was a series of classes available to help people to be able to fit in, to be able to get jobs, and etc. And she was very prominent in the she was in the news a lot in this time period as well.